The United Nations chamber was suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that only follows too many lies told in the same room. Under the bright white lights of the assembly, Benjamin Netanyahu stood tall behind the podium, his tone sharp, his gestures deliberate. Cameras from every corner of the world focused on him as he declared, "Israel fights terrorists. We are defending civilization itself." His voice echoed across marble walls like a sermon to the converted. Some delegates nodded, others looked away. No one dared interrupt, yet. Far back in the hall, Captain Ibrahim Traoré watched without moving. His uniform was simple, unadorned except for the Burkinabe flag stitched on his shoulder. His eyes, calm, unblinking, followed Netanyahu's every word as if studying an enemy's movements. He wasn't supposed to speak that day. The UN agenda had not called for his intervention, but sometimes history doesn't wait for schedules. Netanyahu continued, growing louder, more theatrical. Those who criticize Israel today stand with terror. They stand against freedom. They stand against the West. The words, sharp as arrows, flew across the room, striking the pride of nations. We target those who threaten our people, he said, pounding the podium. Every bomb we drop is a shield for democracy. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The delegates from the global south exchanged uneasy glances. They'd heard this story before, from colonial powers that once claimed to bring civilization with their chains and guns. Netanyahu's eyes swept over the room, daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. Until Traoré stood. The movement was small but seismic. Heads turned, cameras pivoted. For a moment, even Netanyahu paused mid-sentence. Traoré didn't speak yet, he simply adjusted his jacket and looked straight at the Israeli Prime Minister. That single gesture carried more weight than words. "Mr. Netanyahu," Traoré finally said, his voice calm but cutting through the silence like steel. "You say you fight terrorists." His French-accented English was firm, deliberate. "Then tell us, why are you bombing children?" The question hung in the air, heavy and electric. Gasps echoed. A few diplomats instinctively looked toward the press gallery. Journalists leaned forward, hands frozen above keyboards. Netanyahu blinked, his expression freezing into something between anger and disbelief. Traoré didn't stop. "How many schools, how many hospitals, how many refugee camps must burn before you call it what it is?" he asked. "You call it defense. I call it massacre." The hall went completely still again, except this time, it wasn't silence of fear. It was silence of awakening. Netanyahu's jaw tightened as murmurs rippled through the room. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by a man from a small West African nation that Western media barely mentioned. The cameras turned from him to Traoré, capturing the tension like lightning between two worlds. Netanyahu leaned forward, gripping the podium. "You have no idea what it means to fight for survival," he said, his tone dripping with controlled fury. "We are surrounded by enemies who seek our destruction. You speak of children, yet you ignore the rockets fired at us daily." Traoré didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed, calm but unyielding. "And you," he replied, "ignore the children buried under your rubble. You claim to fight terror, but you have become what you fear most, a state that kills to prove it can still dominate." A collective intake of breath filled the chamber. Even the translators hesitated, their voices trembling in the earpieces of delegates. Netanyahu's face reddened. "Watch your words, Captain," he snapped. "You do not understand the complexities of our war." Traoré stepped closer to his microphone, his voice steady as a drumbeat. "War becomes complex only when guilt needs excuses. Gaza was starving before your rockets fell. You didn't bomb militants, you bombed hunger, despair, and hope." The words landed like hammer blows. Delegates from Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East began to murmur again, louder this time, their eyes on Traoré. The young Burkinabe leader stood like a mountain in a storm, small in stature, but impossible to move. Netanyahu tried to regain control. "Israel acts in self-defense," he said, gesturing toward the flag behind him. "We have the right to protect our people." Traoré's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And the people of Gaza? Do they not have that same right?" The question was simple, but it shattered the illusion of moral high ground like glass. In the gallery above, journalists whispered frantically. Social media feeds lit up with the clip within seconds, Traoré versus Netanyahu, trending before the session even ended. Young Africans online began calling him the voice of the unheard. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the kind of power that comes from conviction, not position. You can destroy buildings, he said, but not the idea that every child's life has equal worth. Not even your bombs can erase that truth. Then he stepped back, leaving his final words to echo across the chamber, as Netanyahu stood frozen, his rehearsed confidence finally cracking. The camera zoomed in on Netanyahu's face, his carefully crafted composure now unraveling under the weight of Traoré's words. His fingers tightened around the podium as though he could hold on to authority itself. You dare lecture me about morality? He hissed. Israel has faced centuries of persecution, Captain. We learned to survive when the world turned its back on us. Traoré's expression softened, but his tone remained firm. Yes, you suffered, he said, but suffering does not give you a license to inflict it on others. You cannot heal from oppression by becoming the oppressor. The room trembled with an unspoken truth. Even the diplomats who had come expecting polite speeches could feel it, something historic was happening. Netanyahu tried to counter. We target militants, he repeated, his voice now defensive. We do not target civilians. Traoré raised his hand slightly, interrupting with quiet precision. Then explain to the mothers who buried their children under the debris of your democracy, he said. Explain to the doctors performing surgeries with no electricity, to the fathers digging graves with their bare hands. Tell them about your precision. The audience gasped. Some looked away, others nodded, their silence a kind of agreement. A few Western delegates shifted uncomfortably, pretending to check their phones. Netanyahu's eyes flashed. You speak as if you understand war. You're a soldier, aren't you? I am, said Traoré, and that's exactly why I know the difference between courage and cruelty. His voice deepened. Courage is facing an armed enemy. Cruelty is bombing a child and calling it strategy. The line hit like thunder. For the first time, Netanyahu looked away. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was real. A few claps, then more, spreading across the chamber like sparks igniting a forest. Traoré continued, his words slower now, deliberate. Africa has watched Gaza burn. We've seen colonial powers rename domination as defense. But we will not be silent again. Not when the same lies are dressed in new flags. The young president paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. You call your enemies terrorists, he said, because it is easier than admitting you've lost your humanity. In that moment, the hall no longer felt like the UN, it felt like a courtroom, and Netanyahu was on trial. The applause faded into a heavy silence. Netanyahu straightened his posture, trying to reclaim control of the narrative, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. His voice came quieter now, measured, yet defensive. You speak with passion, Captain, he said, but passion does not build nations. Israel is a democracy, Gaza is ruled by terrorists who hide behind civilians. We do not choose where they hide. They do. Traoré leaned forward, his face illuminated by the harsh UN lights. Democracy? He asked, his tone carrying both disbelief and sorrow. A democracy that bombs hospitals and calls it defense? That blocks medicine and food, then claims moral superiority? He paused, the silence between his words more powerful than sound. If this is democracy, then it's built on graves, not principles. A murmur surged through the hall, diplomats whispering translations, journalists typing furiously. Netanyahu opened his mouth, but Traoré didn't let him speak. I have seen villages in my own land starved by the greed of others, Traoré continued. I've seen foreign powers talk of stability while stealing our gold, our people, our future. They used words like you do, Mr. Netanyahu. Civilization, defense, order, but their hands were red all the same. Netanyahu's patience thinned. You compare Israel to colonizers, he snapped. I don't compare, Traoré said evenly. I identify. The hall froze. The words hit like a bullet made of truth, clean, sharp, impossible to deny. Even the Western delegations who had come to support Israel felt the tension creeping through their veins. Netanyahu exhaled through his nose, a small gesture betraying his anger. "You don't understand the threats we face," he said again, his voice lowering. "You don't live beside enemies sworn to erase you." Traoré's tone hardened. "Neither do you," he said. "You live behind walls, armed by superpowers, financed by nations that look away when you kill the defenseless. You have not faced annihilation, you've imposed it." A faint gasp came from the press balcony. Cameras caught Netanyahu's lips twitch, a mix of rage and fear that he couldn't quite disguise. Traoré took a breath, his final words in that moment landing with precision. "The difference between us, Mr. Netanyahu, is that I fight for my people to live free. You fight to keep others from ever breathing free again." The chamber erupted, not with chaos, but with the quiet thunder of realization. Everyone knew what they had just witnessed, not a debate, but a reckoning. The UN chamber was no longer a stage for diplomacy, it had become an arena of truth. Every delegate, every journalist, every camera operator felt the shift. Netanyahu stood still, his knuckles pale against the podium, his words stuck somewhere between pride and panic. For the first time, the invincible Prime Minister of Israel seemed smaller, not because of Traoré's presence, but because of his own silence. Traoré, meanwhile, stood with the stillness of a mountain before a storm. He wasn't reading from notes. He didn't need to. His voice carried the raw conviction of a man who spoke for millions, not for applause. "When you bomb Gaza," he said, "you don't just destroy buildings. You destroy the illusion that the world has moved beyond barbarism. You remind us that power without conscience is still slavery, only dressed in modern suits." Netanyahu shot back, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "You speak from a place of ignorance. Israel's struggle is unique, no one else lives under such threat." Traoré's eyes narrowed. "Ignorance?" His tone sharpened, but his control never wavered. "Then explain to me, Mr. Netanyahu, why do the oppressed of the world see themselves in the eyes of Palestinians, not in yours? Why do your allies grow fewer, your justifications thinner, your bombs louder?" A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Delegates exchanged glances, some anxious, some emboldened. Traoré was not just confronting a man, he was confronting an entire narrative that had gone unquestioned for decades. He continued, quieter now, but every syllable was deliberate. "I was born in a land where the West said we needed protection, and that protection came with chains. You call Gaza a security risk. They said the same about Africa. Different continent, same lie." The Israeli delegation shifted uncomfortably. Netanyahu's advisors whispered urgently, but the Prime Minister raised his hand, silencing them. His eyes were locked on Traoré. "Be careful with your accusations," Netanyahu warned. "You're stepping into dangerous ground." Traoré's response was immediate. "Danger is nothing new to me. My people have lived under it for centuries. But unlike you, we learned that dignity is worth more than survival." Those words hung in the air like thunder before rain. The young leader from Burkina Faso had said what countless others had thought but never dared to voice in front of the cameras. As Traoré stepped back from the microphone, the silence that followed wasn't weakness, it was power. It was the sound of the world realizing that the narrative was no longer controlled by those with the loudest weapons, but by those with the clearest conscience. Netanyahu's expression hardened. His years of political mastery told him never to appear cornered, yet here he was, outmaneuvered not by a superpower, but by a soldier from a small African nation who spoke truth like a blade. The camera zoomed in on his face, exposing the strain in his jaw, the unease in his eyes. He straightened his tie, forcing a thin smile. "You talk about dignity," he said, his voice now calm but cold, "yet your own nation struggles with poverty and instability. How dare you stand here and preach morality to a country that has built miracles in the desert?" Traoré tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he stepped toward the microphone again. "You built skyscrapers," he said, "while Gaza built graves. You built walls, while we build unity. You built weapons, while we build hope. The crowd murmured again, not just in awe, but in recognition. Every line from Traoré was a mirror turned toward the powerful, reflecting what they didn't want to see. Netanyahu tried to cut him off. Hope doesn't stop rockets, he snapped. No, Traoré replied, but neither do your rockets stop despair. They multiply it. The sentence hit with surgical precision. Delegates from across the global south began nodding subtly. The tide was shifting, and Netanyahu could feel it. Traoré continued, his voice resonant and deliberate. You see, Mr. Netanyahu, power is not measured by how many bombs you drop, but by how many lives you lift. Africa has learned that lesson through pain, through slavery, through colonization, through betrayal. We know what it's like to be labeled uncivilized by those who have never looked in a mirror. Netanyahu's patience broke. This is not about Africa, he barked, his hands slamming the podium. The echo filled the chamber. This is about Israel's right to defend itself. Traoré didn't flinch. Then defend your conscience first. The hall fell silent again. For a moment, even Netanyahu seemed at a loss. The cameras caught his silence, and the world saw what silence looks like when truth crushes arrogance. Traoré looked across the delegates, his tone softening, but his resolve unwavering. If Gaza burns today, he said, Africa weeps. Because every time a child dies under your missiles, the soil of humanity loses another seed. And I promise you, one day, those you bury will rise again as voices louder than your armies. The room erupted in applause, not chaotic, but deliberate, rhythmic, as if the world itself had decided to respond. Netanyahu turned away, his pride pierced deeper than any bullet could reach. The applause rolled through the chamber like a storm, uneven but undeniable. Some delegates clapped cautiously, watching their allies' reactions, others rose to their feet without hesitation. In that moment, the division of the world wasn't east versus west, or north versus south. It was truth versus convenience. Netanyahu forced a tight smile, the kind used by men accustomed to control but suddenly stripped of it. I see you've mastered the art of speeches, Captain, he said through clenched teeth. But speeches don't stop terrorists. Words don't build security. Traoré waited for the murmurs to die down before replying. Neither do bombs build peace, Mr. Netanyahu. You can crush buildings, silence journalists, arrest voices, but you cannot kill the truth that follows you. His tone was calm, but the silence that followed was anything but. Cameras clicked, pens scratched paper furiously. Every outlet from Al Jazeera to CNN knew they were witnessing history, a generational confrontation that would echo beyond the walls of the UN. Traoré continued. You call your war a defense. But defense ends when offense begins. Gaza isn't your battlefield, it's your mirror. Every missile you fire reflects your fear, not your strength. Netanyahu's hand gripped the podium again. And what would you do, President Traoré, he spat, emphasizing the word president as if mocking it, if terrorists surrounded your borders? Traoré met his gaze head-on. They already do, he said. They wear suits, sit in boardrooms, and sign mining contracts. They steal, not with guns, but with pens. And yet, we fight them with dignity, not drones. A wave of reaction swept through the room, a blend of admiration, shock, and reluctant respect. Traoré had done something no African leader had dared in decades. He'd turned Africa from the audience of global politics into its voice. Netanyahu leaned closer to his mic, his composure cracking. You are naive if you think idealism protects you. The world runs on power. Traoré's response was instant, his tone razor-sharp. Then perhaps it's time the powerless start redefining what power means. He looked toward the press section, toward the millions watching live. Because the day will come when the oppressed will stand together, from Gaza to Ouagadougou, and those who built empires on our silence will tremble at our unity. A hush fell again, deep and electric. The UN chamber wasn't just a hall of speeches anymore, it had become the front line of a moral revolution. And at its center stood a soldier, unarmed, except with the truth. Netanyahu could feel it, the air itself turning against him. He had entered the UN hall to assert dominance, but Traoré had rewritten the narrative, one sentence at a time. The young African president wasn't just confronting him, he was unraveling the entire justification for Israel's war, and, by extension, the hypocrisy of the powers that supported it. Still, Netanyahu tried to push back. "You speak as if you represent morality," he said, his tone trembling between frustration and disbelief. "But you lead a small nation with no global power, no influence, no army that can stand against real threats." Traoré nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "We don't have your billions, your weapons, or your propaganda machines. But we have something you lost a long time ago, a conscience." The hall erupted in low gasps. Traoré's delivery was measured, but the precision of his words sliced through the noise like steel through silk. "You measure strength in missiles," he continued, "but we measure it in integrity. You talk about enemies, but you've made enemies of children, of mothers, of the very humanity you claim to defend. You've won every battle, Mr. Netanyahu, except the one for your soul." For a brief second, Netanyahu's mask cracked. His lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. The cameras zoomed in mercilessly, the world watching as his silence became louder than any defense he could give. Traoré turned his attention to the assembly. "To those nations that cheer these bombings in the name of democracy, remember this moment," he said. "One day, when justice stands before you, it will not ask what alliances you kept. It will ask whose blood paid for your silence." The entire room was frozen. Even the translators hesitated, their voices quivering through headsets. "And to those who still believe neutrality is an option," Traoré continued, "remember, silence in the face of injustice is complicity. And complicity, no matter how polite, is guilt." Delegates exchanged glances, guilt, unease, admiration all crossing their faces in waves. Netanyahu's team tried to end the session, signaling to the chair, but the room wasn't ready to move on. Traoré had become the moral center of the hall, his every word drawing gravity. He finished with quiet force. "When history looks back at Gaza, it won't remember the excuses. It will remember the silence. And the silence will damn us all, unless we choose to speak." He stepped away from the microphone. The applause began slowly, like a heartbeat, then grew, rolling through the chamber, unstoppable. The applause was no longer diplomatic, it was thunderous. Delegates from Asia, Latin America, and across Africa rose to their feet, clapping with the kind of passion that no protocol could contain. Even some Western journalists, usually restrained by editorial neutrality, stood up instinctively, caught in the gravity of the moment. Netanyahu stood motionless. His team whispered frantically, trying to salvage what was left of his composure, but he knew, optics had already betrayed him. He had walked into the UN as a statesman and was leaving as a symbol of moral decay. The image would circulate endlessly, an aging leader frozen under the truth spoken by a man half his age. Traoré, meanwhile, walked back to his seat with measured calm. He didn't smile, didn't raise his hand. His silence now carried more weight than Netanyahu's speech ever could. For the young African leader, victory wasn't in humiliating his opponent, it was in showing the world that courage could still exist in politics. As he sat down, reporters whispered to each other. "This is history," one from The Guardian murmured. He didn't just confront Netanyahu, he confronted the entire system. In the corner of the hall, a U.S. delegate leaned toward his colleague. "He's dangerous," he whispered. "Not because of what he says, but because people believe him." Outside the building, the news had already spread. Social media platforms flooded with clips titled, "The Day Africa Spoke for Gaza." Hashtags like #TraoréSpeaksTruth and #AfricaForGaza trended across continents. In the streets of Dakar, Nairobi, Bamako, and even Paris, young Africans gathered in squares watching the replay on giant screens. Traoré's words weren't just being heard, they were being felt. That night, as journalists rushed to file their stories, a CNN analyst summed it up perfectly: for decades, African leaders came to the UN to ask. Today, one came to remind the world it should listen. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's office released a brief statement dismissing Traoré's remarks as emotional rhetoric detached from the realities of security. But the damage was done. Every network replayed his outburst: "This is not about Africa." Alongside Traoré's calm response, "Then defend your conscience first." And for millions watching, that was all they needed to decide who truly represented strength. By midnight, the world had already chosen its side. Across Africa, young people filled the streets, waving flags of Burkina Faso and Palestine side by side. Murals appeared overnight, portraits of Ibrahim Traoré painted beside the word "truth." In Johannesburg, students projected his UN speech on the walls of abandoned buildings. In Cairo and Dakar, people shouted his name in unison. For the first time in years, Africa wasn't silent, it was roaring. Inside his modest hotel suite overlooking New York's skyline, Traoré stood by the window, his reflection framed against the glowing city lights. Marie, his aide, entered quietly, holding her tablet. "Mr. President," she said softly, "your words have reached 200 million views in less than a day." Traoré didn't react with pride. He only nodded. "It's not about views, Marie," he said. "It's about awakening." Marie smiled faintly. "You've done that, sir. They're calling you the voice of the voiceless." He turned away from the window, his eyes steady. "No," he said, "the people have always had a voice. They just needed someone to remind them they could use it." Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu stared at a muted television screen replaying the same headline across networks: "Traoré shames Netanyahu at the UN." His advisors debated strategy, whether to attack or ignore the young leader. Netanyahu finally spoke, his tone cold and weary. "He's dangerous because he doesn't want power, he wants change. That's harder to kill." Back in New York, Traoré prepared to leave for his flight. As he walked through the quiet corridors of the UN, a journalist stopped him. "Mr. President," she called out, "do you think Israel will ever stop?" Traoré paused, then replied, "Only when the world stops pretending not to see." The simplicity of his answer struck like lightning. It wasn't political, it was human. And that's what made it unstoppable. Hours later, his plane took off from JFK, cutting through the night sky. As he looked out the window, he saw the horizon slowly lighten, the first signs of dawn. "Every empire," he murmured, "believes the sun will never set on its power. But every sunrise proves otherwise." Below, millions continued to share his words, not as sound bites but as rallying cries. For them, Traoré wasn't just a leader, he was a reminder that truth, once spoken with courage, could become a weapon mightier than any bomb. And somewhere between New York and Ouagadougou, he smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "Let them bomb the sky. We'll own the dawn."